is this a precursor to bigger problems down the road if this continues? I guess is a big thing. And just kind of give us an overview of what you feel, what your opinion is, what's happening with the earthquakes.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I can address the first question in a fairly straightforward manner. The earthquakes are occurring along an earthquake fault zone system that we know was left over from time when South Carolina was part of the big supercontinent Pangea. And when it split apart, the Atlantic Ocean formed, it left this zone of weakness that runs through Kershaw County right now. And the geologists from the South Carolina Geological Survey have mapped this out. They call it the South Carolina Eastern Piedmont Fault System. And that zone of pre-existing weakness is a place where stress from the earth moving around kind of focuses and produces these small earthquakes. That's why the earthquakes are occurring along this zone of pre-existing weakness. The second question is one that's come up, and it's actually pretty common and very concerning. And what I have to say about that is that these earthquakes neither make the likelihood of a large earthquake any larger nor smaller than it would have been otherwise. Having said that, these fault zones in the Midlands and in the upstate have not historically ever produced a large earthquake, nor is there any geological evidence that they do ever produce large earthquakes. So it would be quite unexpected and extremely surprising. There's nothing about this that indicates that we're building into, like, quote, the big one.
Give me a timeline as far as when you estimated it happened, and how many earthquakes have we experienced regionally lately?
So this earthquake sequence, if that's what you're asking, this earthquake sequence started out with a magnitude 3.3 earthquake, which isn't really particularly large on the magnitude scale of earthquakes. Magnitude 3 earthquake, just for reference, happens along big fault system, like up in Alaska or in California, on an almost daily basis. But it's big for South Carolina. And South Carolina earthquakes, even at that magnitude, can be felt for hundreds of miles around. But it started on December 27th of 2021. And the last one that we felt was May 21st. And it was only felt by less than 10 people. And it was about a magnitude 1.8 and a 1.9, both occurred together on that day. And that's pretty common. They come in little clusters. And so that's the timeline that we were seeing these earthquake events. This one has been 30 earthquakes long. And just for reference, swarms of earthquakes do very commonly occur in South Carolina along these ancient fault systems, as the fault kind of progressively unlocks or unzips, kind of like a zipper or a crack propagating. Most of the swarms that we get are 4 to 10 earthquakes. And so this one at 30 earthquakes is pretty big, pretty long, but it's nothing to be concerned about. It's unusual, but not abnormal behavior for the earth in South Carolina.
What about on the sequence of these occurring? How much longer do you think the earthquakes will take place?
I wish I could answer that. The earth does kind of what it wants to do. Like I said, we've seen 30 earthquakes in this little swarm of them around Elgin, Lugoff, and it should have stopped about 20 earthquakes ago if it's going to be much like the normal ones, normal sets of these. So I think it's like one of those catastrophic floods that we get every 500 years, every 1,000 years. The earth is gonna pop off with a whole bunch of little firecrackers here. I call them little pops because they're much smaller earthquakes. I expect, if I had to forecast, if I had to be prognosticator and look into a crystal ball, I would say that we've already seen the last earthquake in this sequence of events at
Really?
30 earthquakes. But there
Huh.
may be another one. There may be another one or two. In other parts of the country, these earthquakes can go on for up to a year in these little swarms or events. And that's typically the very upper bound. So we usually don't see them going on for that long. And in South Carolina, this one has got 3 times as many events already as what typically occurs. So I would expect that it's about to be over or it's already over.
What is your opinion if people in the area feel the tremor of the earthquake? What should they do?
Well, the thing to always do in an earthquake is to not run outside, because there's danger of down power lines, flying glass, anything like that. They should stay indoors. They should seek shelter under a sturdy object like a study table or door frame of their residence. That's usually the structurally strongest place. But I'm a geologist and a seismologist, and the emergency management division, I talked to folks over at Kershaw Emergency Management Division in South Carolina, Emergency Management Division, and those folks have a lot of great resources on their websites and have been very helpful in determining what happens. If something really shakes and you feel like your house may have moved a little bit on its foundation or so forth, I would call the local fire department, local emergency management, and make sure that no gas lines are severed. There's no other problems like that around their houses. But again, these earthquakes are not at the levels that typically lead to damage. We have had 0 damage reports. Actually, I take that back. I think somebody reported a chicken coop lost its roof, kind of shook it off during one of the bigger earthquakes. But that's the extent of damage that we've seen so far.
Well, now, what is your opinion? If we're already at the end of this, the earthquake sequence,
Mm-hmm.
What is your opinion? How much longer until the next sequence will come up?
That's a really good question. And that's why we have an advanced national seismic network that we're part of here in South Carolina. We're trying to understand what's called the recurrence intervals of these earthquakes. We can't predict earthquakes. We don't really understand what that trigger is. We know that it's a buildup of stress, and the Earth is going to relieve that stress along lines of a pre-existing weakness. We may never see another earthquake sequence like this again in Kershaw County, but we regularly see swarms of 4 to 10 small earthquakes like magnitude 2 and 3 occurring somewhere in the state of South Carolina on an annual basis. So I think that people need not be worried that this particular sequence of events is going to build up and increase in size until we have a major rupture. We've probably seen enough stress release already along this fault, and the latest earthquakes that we've seen within our network here as part of the Advanced National Seismic System have actually been up around the Catawba area, where there's been a series of smaller earthquakes. So maybe most of the activity is up there now. It's very hard to predict.
What about other parts of South Carolina? Charleston, I'm a real estate developer by trade.
Uh-huh.
You got businesses moving to the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia in droves. Charleston in particular, it's got the Bowens of the world. It's got all the network of businesses. What about them? Are they more likely or less likely?
Charleston historically has been one of the most likely places to experience an earthquake in South Carolina. In 1886, we had probably the largest earthquake ever on the east coast of the United States that's known, and that occurred right outside of Charleston. It was in 1886. We didn't have the Advanced National Seismic System, so we estimate where the center of the earthquake might have been, but it seems to be in North Charleston to Moncks Corner area. And we typically see earthquakes occurring there. I mean, I don't want to give it a recurrence interval that's too precise, but every month, every 3 months, but they're very small. So a magnitude 2 earthquake can barely be felt, and we typically see earthquakes that are much less than that. Our seismic system can detect earthquakes down to magnitudes that are close to 0 or even negative. That's just a mathematical way of formulating what the energy release from an earthquake is. But there's another way of measuring an earthquake. It's called an intensity. And the earthquakes that we can pick up in our very sensitive seismic instruments, using these scientific seismic arrays, they often can't be felt. They are usually never felt by the public down in Charleston. So if I say that they occur every month or two, they're not being felt by anybody. But it's still a good idea to make sure that you're prepared in the event of an earthquake. And it's very similar to being prepared for a hurricane, which is, a much more real, I think, and expected threat.
Okay. Now, at South Carolina, what's your specific areas that you cover? I assume you teach this in your classes.
Oh, yeah. So I'm a professor at the University of South Carolina, as well as the director for the South Carolina Seismic Network. And the South Carolina Seismic Network is funded partly by the U.S. Geological Survey as part of the Advanced National Seismic System, and partly by the Department of Energy to keep tabs on strong motion and help the geotechnical engineering at Savannah Riverside.
Well, thank you, Dr. White. Thank you a lot.
Thanks for the time, Congressman.
Yes, sir.